Ma'am, the accessibility seating is over to your left. We can get you a much better view without you having to stand in the sun. The voice was young, earnest, and deeply respectful. Lance Corporal Davies, all of 19 years old and sharp as a tack in his dress blues, gestured with a white-gloved hand toward a covered section of bleachers. He saw a woman who reminded him of his own grandmother, silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, a simple floral dress that had seen better decades, and thin, papery skin on her hands. She was standing alone, slightly apart from the boisterous, crying, flag-waving families, her posture unnervingly still. He'd been assigned to crowd assistance, and his instructions were clear: ensure the comfort of the families, especially the elderly. This woman, with her placid expression and a small, worn leather purse clutched in her hands, looked like she needed a bit of gentle guidance. She didn't seem frail exactly, but old. And old, in the humid heat of a Paris Island morning, meant she was a priority. He smiled his most reassuring, regulation-approved smile. Her eyes, however, were not what he expected. They were a pale, washed-out blue, but they weren't cloudy with age. They were clear, sharp, and when they met his, they didn't just see him, they assessed him. For a fraction of a second, he felt an absurd impulse to straighten his posture even more, as if he were standing before an inspecting officer. She offered a small, polite smile in return, a slight crinkling at the corners of those observant eyes. "Thank you, Corporal. I'm quite all right here." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strange resonance, a firmness that belied her appearance. It wasn't the quavering tone of age he'd anticipated. It was measured, calm, and final. Davies blinked, his pre-planned script of helpfulness momentarily derailed. "But ma'am, the ceremony will last over an hour. This asphalt gets hot. We have water and shade." He was trying to be helpful, to do his duty, but she just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I've stood for longer in worse heat, son. I prefer to be here." She turned her attention back to the vast expanse of the parade deck, where formations of new Marines were beginning to assemble in the distance, their movements precise and unified. The sound of a drill instructor's cadence, a rhythmic guttural bark, echoed across the field. Most families were focused on finding their son or daughter in the sea of identical figures. This woman, however, seemed to be watching the entire formation, her gaze taking in the intervals, the alignment, the collective discipline of the whole. It was the look of a professional appraising a piece of work, not a grandmother searching for a familiar face. Lance Corporal Davies felt a prickle of unease. He was trained to follow orders and to ensure procedures were followed. The accessibility seating was there for a reason. His staff sergeant would have his hide if a guest collapsed from heat exhaustion on his watch. He decided to try a different approach, one that appealed to familial pride. "Which company is your grandson in, ma'am? Perhaps I can point out where they'll be standing. From here, the view isn't the best." He thought this was a clever tactic. All the families wanted the best view. It was the entire point of the jostling and the early arrivals. She didn't look away from the parade deck. "Platoon 3086, Lima Company, 3rd Battalion." She said it without hesitation, without the typical fumbling for a crumpled letter from a pocket or purse. The designations rolled off her tongue with a familiarity that was, once again, slightly odd. "My grandson is Private Leo Casper." A flicker of warmth finally entered her voice at the mention of his name, the first genuine crack in her serene, controlled facade. "He's the guide." "Tall kid? Second squad?" Davies was impressed. Most families barely knew the company, let alone the platoon and battalion. Knowing the specific platoon guide's position was next level. He scanned the formations, his own trained eyes picking out the guidon-bearer for Lima Company. "Yes, ma'am, I see him. A place of honor." He tried again, his voice gentle. "All the more reason to get you a comfortable seat. He'll want to see you properly when they march past." She finally turned her head to look at him fully. The sun caught the fine lines around her eyes. "He knows I'm here. That's enough." Her gaze drifted past him over the heads of the crowd, noting the security details at the perimeter, the placement of the reviewing stand, the ingress and egress routes. It was an unconscious, systematic scan that Davies himself had been trained to do, but seeing it in this old woman was deeply strange. He saw her hands, which he'd first registered as frail, in a new light. They were slender, yes, but the knuckles were slightly enlarged, and a thin, silvery scar traced a line from her thumb to her wrist on her right hand. They were hands that had not spent a lifetime in quiet repose. Defeated, and feeling strangely like he'd been dismissed by a superior officer, Davies gave a slight nod. "Very well, ma'am. If you need anything, please let me know." He stepped back, intending to keep an eye on her from a distance. The band struck up, the sharp, brassy notes of the Marines' hymn cutting through the thick, humid air. The crowd surged with emotion, a wave of cheers and tears. The woman, Eleanor Casper, didn't cheer. She simply stood, her back straighter than any of the new Marines on the field, and watched. Her expression was one of profound, quiet pride, an emotion so deep and contained it seemed to have a physical weight. Davies moved on to help another family, but he couldn't shake the image of the old woman who stood like a statue, watching the ceremony with an expert's eye. The ceremony proceeded with the flawless, intimidating precision that defined the Marine Corps. The massive platoons moved as one organism, a living machine of green and khaki. Commands were barked, rifles were snapped to shoulders in perfect unison, and the guidons of each platoon fluttered in the breeze. The families around Eleanor were a storm of emotion. Fathers wept openly. Mothers clutched tissues, siblings screamed names that were swallowed by the sheer scale of the event. Through it all, Eleanor remained a fixed point of tranquility. Her focus never wavered from the field. She watched the pass in review, her eyes tracking the lines, the posture, the bearing of the new Marines. She saw the subtle tells of exhaustion beneath the rigid discipline, the fierce pride in their young faces. She saw her grandson, Leo, his jaw set, his eyes locked forward as he marched past, holding the platoon guidon with a strength that made her heart swell. It was a controlled, disciplined pride, a mirror of her own. She allowed herself a small, private smile. She wasn't just seeing a grandson, she was seeing the continuation of a legacy, the forging of another link in a chain she knew intimately. The heat was beginning to bake the asphalt, and the air was thick enough to drink. Several people in the crowd were fanning themselves with programs. Eleanor didn't seem to notice. Her breathing was even and slow, her body perfectly acclimated to discomfort. She had, as she'd told the young corporal, stood in far worse. She'd stood in the biting cold of a Korean winter, waiting for an extraction that was hours late. She'd stood in the suffocating humidity of a jungle, in a place that didn't officially exist on any map, listening for the snap of a twig that would mean the difference between life and death. The heat of a South Carolina morning was nothing. From the elevated reviewing stand, Colonel Marcus Thorne, the commanding officer of the recruit depot, watched the final formations with a critical yet paternal eye. He was a man in his late 40s, lean and weathered, with the quiet authority that came from a lifetime of service. Graduation days were his favorite. They were the culmination, the proof of concept. They were the day the raw material of civilian life was officially stamped as United States Marine. It was a sacred, transformative process, and he savored it. After the final salute and the commanding general's brief, powerful remarks, the new Marines were dismissed. The iconic moment when the drill instructors finally addressed their platoons by the title of Marine for the first time was met with a roar from the crowd. Chaos erupted as the formation broke and families surged forward, desperate to find and embrace their new Marine. Colonel Thorne remained on the stand for a few moments, observing the joyous reunions. It was his custom to then walk among the families, offering a handshake to a proud father or a word of congratulations to a weeping mother. It was part of the job, the human element of command. He descended the steps and began to move through the crowd, his presence creating a small ripple of respectful deference. Marines snapped to attention as he passed, and parents pointed him out to their children in hushed tones. He moved with an easy, unhurried gait, his eyes scanning the faces, sharing in their joy. And then he saw her. She was standing in the same spot, an island of calm in the churning sea of people. Her grandson, Private Leo Casper, had not yet reached her. She was waiting patiently, her gaze fixed on the spot where his platoon was gathering their things. Colonel Thorne was about to offer her a polite, "Congratulations, ma'am," and move on, but something stopped him. It was her posture. It was perfect. Not just straight, but aligned. Her shoulders were back, her head was up, her weight was evenly distributed. It was the posture of someone who had spent thousands of hours on a drill square. Someone for whom discipline was not an act, but a state of being. It was the posture of an old-school NCO. Intrigued, he altered his path, moving closer. He was only a few feet away when his eyes caught it. Her dress had a short-sleeved cut, and as she shifted her weight, the fabric pulled just enough to reveal a small, faded design on the inside of her right forearm. It was a simple tattoo, the ink blurred and softened by decades of sun and time. It was barely an inch across. It wasn't a fiery skull or a bulldog or any of the common military designs. It was a simple, stylized spearhead, bisected by a single jagged line of what could have been lightning. Colonel Marcus Thorne stopped dead. His breath hitched in his chest and the polite smile on his face vanished, replaced by a look of utter, profound disbelief. The sounds of the celebration around him, the laughter, the crying, the shouted congratulations, faded into a dull, distant roar. In that moment, there was only the old woman and the faded ink on her arm. He felt a jolt, a shock of recognition so powerful it was like a physical blow. He had seen that symbol only twice before in his entire life. Once in a dusty classified file in a SCIF in Quantico, in a folder detailing a unit so secret its official name was just a string of numbers, and once on the wrinkled hand of a legendary sergeant major, a man who had been his mentor 2 decades ago, a man who spoke in hushed, reverent tones of the Jedburghs and the Maxaw ghosts who wrote the rulebook he'd lived by. The symbol wasn't just a tattoo, it was a key. It was a ghost from a past that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It was the mark of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA and Special Forces, specifically from an ultra-secretive unit that operated behind enemy lines, a unit that officially had never included women. Lance Corporal Davies, who was still trying to subtly keep an eye on the old woman, saw the entire exchange. He saw the base commander, a man whose presence made even gunnery sergeants stand up straighter, freeze in his tracks. He saw the colonel's face drain of color, his eyes locked on the woman's arm. Davies' mind raced. Was she in trouble? Did she have some kind of restricted symbol? Was she a protester? Nothing made sense. The colonel took a slow, deliberate step forward. He moved not like a commander approaching a civilian, but like a pilgrim approaching a sacred shrine. When he spoke, his voice was low, barely a whisper, and it was filled with an emotion Davies had never heard from an officer before. Awe. "Ma'am," Colonel Thorne began, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "Pardon me, ma'am, that marking on your arm, I have to ask." Eleanor looked at him, her pale blue eyes unreadable. She glanced down at her own arm, as if noticing the tattoo for the first time in years. "It's old," she said simply. Her voice was calm, giving nothing away. But the colonel was not deterred. He knew what he was seeing. The history books were wrong. The classified files were incomplete. He was looking at living history. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice dropping even lower, pitching it so only she could hear. "Fairbairn Sykes' presentation grip. What's the proper response to 'the shadow of the moon is long'?" It was a challenge and response code, a ghost code from a forgotten war, a question that had no meaning to anyone else on that parade deck, but to the person it was intended for, it was everything. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for over 70 years. Eleanor Kaspar's placid expression finally broke. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face, a smile that seemed to erase the years, revealing a glimpse of the formidable young woman she had once been. Her eyes glinted with a light that was anything but grandmotherly. It was the light of shared, dangerous knowledge. She leaned in slightly, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that was sharp and clear despite its softness. "But the night is short for those who wait." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "And we never waited, did we, Colonel?" Colonel Thorne felt a wave of vertigo. It was real. The stories his mentor had told him, the whispers of the nightingales, the women who dropped into France and Burma, who were tougher and deadlier than any of their male counterparts, women whose files were burned or buried so deep they might as well have been. They were true. He was standing in front of one. He instinctively, without conscious thought, brought his heels together. His back went ramrod straight. His hand came up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it could have cut glass. It was not the perfunctory salute of a senior officer to a civilian. It was the deep, instinctual gesture of respect a warrior gives to a legend. The few people nearby who noticed the exchange were utterly bewildered. A two-star general wouldn't have gotten a salute that crisp from the base commander in this setting. Lance Corporal Davis's jaw was literally hanging open. He stared, unblinking, trying to process the impossible scene before him. The frail old woman in the floral dress was being saluted by the commanding officer of Paris Island as if she were the commandant of the Marine Corps herself. Eleanor simply nodded her head in acknowledgement, accepting the gesture as her due. "At ease, Colonel," she said, the authority in her voice now unmistakable. It was quiet, but it was absolute. It was the voice of command. Just then, a young, exhausted, and radiantly happy private pushed through the crowd. "Grandma!" Leo Casper's face was beaming, streaked with sweat and tears of joy. "You made it. I looked for you in the stands." He trailed off, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. His grandmother was standing face to face with the base commander, Colonel Thorne, who was holding a rigid salute. Leo froze, his training kicking in, and he immediately snapped to attention. "Sir!" Colonel Thorne slowly, reluctantly lowered his hand. He turned to the new Marine, his expression one of profound gravity. "Private Caspar," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "do you have any idea who this woman is?" Leo looked from the colonel to his grandmother, his face a mask of confusion. "Sir, this is my grandma, Eleanor." The colonel shook his head, a small, incredulous smile playing on his lips. "Private, this woman and a handful of others like her. They wrote the book that men like me have been trying to read for the last 75 years. He looked back at Eleanor, his eyes full of questions he would never dare to ask. He didn't need to. The shared understanding was enough. He gestured to the faded tattoo. "OSS, ma'am?" he asked, a question of formality. She simply nodded. "Operational Group, Burma." The words hung in the air, each one a bombshell of history. Burma, the jungle. Behind Japanese lines, operational groups were the commandos of the OSS, the precursors to the Green Berets. They were hard, ruthless men who specialized in unconventional warfare. And this quiet, gentle-looking woman had been one of them. Leo stared at his grandmother, the woman who made him oatmeal cookies and helped him with his history homework. The woman who always smelled faintly of lavender and old books. He tried to reconcile that image with the words the colonel had just spoken. Burma, OSS. It was impossible. He looked at her hands, really looked at them for the first time, and saw the scar, the strong knuckles. He saw the way she stood, never fidgeting, always balanced. He saw the clarity in her eyes, the unnerving stillness he had always known but never understood. It all clicked into place with the force of a chambered round. His grandmother wasn't just a grandmother, she was a giant, hiding in plain sight. Colonel Thorne turned back to Leo. "Your drill instructors taught you about courage, Private. They taught you about honor, commitment, and sacrifice. They gave you the tools." He then gestured respectfully toward Eleanor. "She is the reason those words have meaning. She lived them when there were no parades, no families, no recognition. Only a mission and the person next to her." He looked Eleanor in the eye one last time. "It is an honor to have you on my depot, ma'am. A profound honor." He gave her a slight, respectful bow of his head, a gesture far more intimate and meaningful than the salute. Then, with a final nod to the stunned Private Casper, he turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd, leaving the family to their reunion. Leo stood in stunned silence for a long moment, the joyous noise of the graduation day seeming to come from a great distance. He looked at his grandmother, seeing her not as the woman who raised him after his parents passed, but as a warrior, a clandestine hero whose story was written in invisible ink. He felt a wave of humility so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had just endured 13 of the hardest weeks of his life, and he had felt like a titan. Now, standing before his own grandmother, he felt like a child. "Grandma," he finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper, You never said anything." Eleanor reached out and gently adjusted the collar on his service uniform, her touch both familiar and suddenly freighted with new meaning. Her fingers were steady and sure. "There was nothing to say, Leo," she said softly. The work was the reward. The coming home was the victory. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time, he saw past the grandmother and glimpsed the operator. "What you did here, what you have sworn to do, that is what matters now. Your story. I'm just here to see the next chapter begin." She smiled, and the fierce warrior receded, leaving behind the loving grandmother he had always known. But he could never unsee it now. He knew that beneath the floral dress and the silver hair was a foundation of pure, tempered steel. He felt his posture straighten, his shoulders squaring, not out of training, but out of a sudden, overwhelming need to be worthy of the blood that ran in his veins. He looked out over the parade deck, at the flag snapping in the wind, and understood. The legacy he had just sworn to uphold was more personal, more profound than he ever could have imagined. He wrapped his arms around his grandmother, his big new marine frame enveloping her small one. He held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender, now mingled with the faint imaginary scent of gunpowder and history. The crowd continued to celebrate, but for one new Marine and his quiet, unassuming grandmother, the world had just shifted on its axis, revealing a truth more honorable and inspiring than any parade.